Alexa, daytime on.
What's the build? Show us your build, please. It looks like he's running Hunter's Fury. Make a build video. We need your build, bro. May I know why your teammate destroys the sniper turret like so
What
easy?
did you shoot the turret
Great
with?
run and big
Can you
congrats
push your
to you both.
Scorpio build
For
for
the
the
first
talent
area
pool,
you showcased
please?
the
How are
build
you
you were
using
using
for
for this?
this?
YouTube incursion.
How do you
Make
explain
sure
your
you
career?
break down on
I'd
that.
like to know which
build
build
is
is
best.
how many
Can you
hours
find
this
one?
Okay.
If it wasn't obvious before the release of the incursion, it certainly is now. Striker's battle gear is the best DPS gear set in the Division 2. This gear set saw a significant buff several title updates ago that revived it from a low to mid tier unrewarding build to the absolute pinnacle of dealing damage. That said, there is a lot of conflicting information online surrounding the gear set. With all of this conflicting information, how can you know that the way you've set up your build is the best way? Should you be looking for damage to armor or damage to targets out of cover, or should you prioritize crit? How on earth was I dealing damage to one shot each health phase to right in our duo incursion run? All will become apparent shortly. In this video, I'm going to explain all best in slot variants of strikers alongside when you should run each variant. For instance, a headshot build is worthless if you're shooting electronics. A chest build may not be smart if there aren't lots of enemies, and so on. So without much further ado, let's get into it. If this video helped you, please like, comment and subscribe. Given this gear set has found its way into the spotlight due to the recent release of the game's first incursion, Paradise Lost, it seems logical to cover the best general variant for that first. Whether you want an easy flawless, or just want to clear the incursion, this is the build you should be running as default. The build is pretty simple. It consists of 4 pieces of striker, including chest and backpack, with the exotic Coyote's mask and named contractor's gloves. All rolls a critical hit chance to 50%, then critical hit damage. Weapons here are up to you. Ultimately, the build is the important element, but as some suggestions, if you have it, Ouroboros is always going to be the best option as a primary. It has a high fire rate which will help with building and maintaining stacks, and the damage this weapon puts out is just unrivaled. Another option for your exotic slot is St. Elmo's. Now, this is not saying it's the best weapon in the game, or any other clickbaity or misleading claim. Rather, it's got good mag damage, and the intrinsic shot can be a useful help if you're struggling to stay alive. Finally, your exotic slot can be consumed by Scorpio. This is a really mindless way of playing the game since all enemies are stun locked, and the damage from strikers will basically put anything down quickly. This is what I opted for in several areas of my duo clear. For secondary, I usually run a FAMAS. I've currently got Optimist rolled on my FAMAS. This is because I use the same gun for headshot and crit builds, so a one-size-fits-all talent is beneficial. That said, if you're only going to run crit, Strained is a higher damage option, and Fast Hands can be good to improve sustained DPS. If you struggle with building stacks, or there aren't loads of enemies around you, you can run an ACS 12 in place of the FAMAS. This will allow you to build stacks incredibly quickly, but you should really consider whether you need this or not. If you don't, you've basically just thrown away a weapon slot. It's also worth noting that contractors only overtake the alternative setup, Grupo Sombra gloves in place of contractors, if you hit a reasonable proportion of your shots as headshots. That said, thinking specifically of the incursion, this shouldn't be a huge challenge as bosses are large and mostly stationary. For specialization, I'd narrow the selection to 2 choices unless your team is desperately needing buffs, such as the Demolitionist damage to targets out of cover. These are Gunner and Firewall. Gunner is usually my go-to because the handling, ammo regen, and armor on kill are really nice passive buffs, and in my opinion, this build doesn't struggle with damage so you won't feel like you're missing out. That said, if you do want to absolutely min-max damage, Firewall is a good option due to the Striker Shield. This shield will allow you to take advantage of the amplified damage buff to enemies stood in front of the shield, and for boss burns, your team can stand behind you to also benefit from this buff. So that's the build. When should you use it? As I touched on earlier, this build is a pretty standard default type build. It doesn't specialize in anything, thus you can basically run it anywhere that you're confident you can maintain stacks. It'll do a good job at dealing with ads, electronics, and basically anything you throw at it, regardless of if you're hitting heads or not. In short, if you don't have a reason to run another variant, run this one. Leading on from the first variant, the second is very similar. This is of course Obliterate Crit Strikers. Whilst top end damage of this build is lower than the Striker's chest variant, it has the huge advantage that you'll reach the top end many multitudes faster. This is because use of an alternative chest talent means that Strikers has half the number of stacks, aka 100, to reach maximum damage. Obliterate, which will be the chest talent of choice, requires 25 critical hits to reach its max potential. Thus, fire 100 bullets and you're totally stacked up. The build looks like this. We'll be using the Coyote's Mask again, with 4-piece Strikers, but this time we'll be running a Grupo Sombra Obliterate chest. Note that if you're comfortable hitting heads, you can switch this Grupo chest for a Providence one. But keep in mind this will significantly reduce your damage output against electronics and on body shots. Similarly to the first variant, we'll be rolling critical hit chance to 50%, then critical hit damage on this build. Weapon choices are largely the same, but there should be absolutely no reason to ever equip an ACS-12 here. Simply put, if you can't achieve 100 stacks with your usual go-to weapons, you probably shouldn't run Strikers in that scenario. Better options, such as high-end builds, will likely perform better. So where should you use this? This is where a bit of self-awareness is going to need to be exercised. Fundamentally, this is a worse build than the chest variant, if our only concern is damage. But that statement is built on an assumption of max stacks with each, which may not be the case when you use it in practice. If you find yourself frequently noticing a scenario where you're running the chest variant but you are not at max stacks, you should consider a switch to this build for that scenario. To materialise this a bit, I tend to run this variant for the entrance encounter in the incursion. Put simply, there just aren't enough enemies to build optimal Strikers chest stacks without really going out of your way to do so. And by the time you built your stacks with the Strikers chest variant, you could have just completed the encounter with the Obliterate one. So yes, a bit of a wishy-washy answer, but just apply common sense and self-awareness with this. Over time, the decision will become easier and more unconscious. We've covered off our big critters, now let's look at what I'd argue to be the most OP but also most situational variant. This build will literally allow you to carry 3 people through certain areas of the incursion, and it was a huge reason we cleared the duo incursion. It's also proven itself to be a monster in raids and basically anywhere you want to put out huge damage quickly. If you haven't guessed already, this is the juicy headshot pistol variant. The build looks like this: 4 pieces of Strikers, including chest and backpack, the Dodge City exotic holster, and a punch-drunk mask. All rolls on your gear will be for headshot damage. This will massively boost your damage both with the Dodge City holster and with an Achilles pulse, which is the primary focus of this build. As far as weapons go, I would pick an ACS-12 to accumulate and maintain stacks, then a good assault rifle with Optimist as your secondary. Due to its best in slot status, I usually pick FAMAS here. The most important weapon for this build is the pistol you use. Due to having the highest base damage for any pistol in the game, Regulus is the best option here. But if you don't have it, it's not a problem. Liberty or D50 will still do significant damage, albeit a little bit lower than Regulus. In my duo clear, I ran D50 on the right encounter to free up my exotic slot for Scorpio, and I still comfortably almost soloed the boss damage portions of the fight. It really isn't a be-all and end-all if you don't have Regulus. There is of course another key element to this build which we need to cover, and that's the Achilles pulse. This will be your primary source of damage, and it synergizes nicely with the cooldown of Dodge City. You get one shot to deal all your damage, then you can go back to whatever you were doing before, whether that's clearing ads or completing mechanics. The caveat is that you will only get one Achilles zone because you're at skill tier 0, so you need to be observant of where this zone is to capitalize on the buff. For specialization, it's very similar to the first build's options. Gunner can provide some passive buffs, but as this is a build primarily focused on dealing a chunk of damage, I would lean towards Firewall if you're comfortable without the survivability boosts that Gunner provides. Any additional buffs increase that huge shot, so they're very welcome. So this is obviously very situational. Where do you use it? Unless you're running coordinated speedrun strategies, I would strongly advise against having more than one of these builds on your team at any time. Whilst it does crazy damage for the one shot you have charged up, it does lack flexibility in damage output. For instance, your damage to Chungas and electronics will be much lower than the crit build, since Chunga armor and electronics don't have heads. This is also not a useful build if you don't have a target that can actually take the damage you're dealing. For instance, a heroic difficulty boss will usually possess around a tenth of the health this build puts out, so you're sacrificing a lot to deal a huge excess of damage if you choose to run this build there. With all that said, in the right circumstance, with the right enemies and teammates in crit builds capable of picking up the slack, this build is absolutely absurd. Even if you don't run it regularly, I would recommend putting it together and testing it at least once. I mean, no one is going to find dealing 400 million in a single shot not fun. So that about wraps up the whistle stop tour of the best strikers builds currently in the game, and I hope it's a useful overview. Let me know which build is your go-to in the comments, and of course if you have any questions, feel free to drop them there too. Also, if you enjoyed this video, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel out massively and means you won't miss future videos or live streams. Thanks for watching.